Okay, we're going to get started again. Try to keep up this pattern of having amazingly on time and interesting and sessions with tons of discussion. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Milind Javle, who probably doesn't need much introduction, but for those of you who are new to cholangio, he's a professor of medicine at the University of Texas at MD Anderson in Houston. His main focus of research has been GI oncology, in particular the cancers of the bile duct and pancreas. That's why you see his name on so many of the reference slides. He's well published and has very importantly taken on roles at the Cholangiocarcinoma and importantly leading the international initiative for a cholangiocarcinoma research network, which he's going to review right now with progress. Thanks, Milind.
Thank you very much, Jen. And let me first start by saying that for too long, the research community has been working in silos. Not really collaborative, and if you can imagine in an uncommon disease like this, if we do that, progress is going to stall. So that was really the thesis behind the network, so that we could get together and make some drastic change in this disease. So our goal here with the International Cholangiocarcinoma Research Network that was set up about 3 years ago was to promote clinical research and increase access to clinical trials for cholangiocarcinoma patients globally. Because progress can only come through trials. And as you heard from Miranda's very eloquent presentation, that patients want trials. Patients want innovation. Patients don't want blind chemotherapy. And then we had also a very simple additional goal that was to establish a repository, both of tissue and data, that would form the basis for collaboration, that this data could then be tapped into by investigators to create for innovation. So just to give you a background of clinical trials in cholangiocarcinoma, we do have a lot of trials now, but this slide is probably a little over a year old. Multiple myeloma, a little more common than cholangiocarcinoma, but has 342 trials. If you look at ALL or leukemia, which is acute lymphoblastic leukemia, probably has a similar incidence as cholangiocarcinoma, 217 trials. Cholangiocarcinoma, on the other hand, 46 trials. This number may have gone up slightly, but as you can see, there is a great disparity. So why is there a disparity? And we started looking at that. And some of the answers we got were that it's a rare disease, outcome is what it is. There's no drug approved for cholangiocarcinoma even today in 2019. There's really no drug approved for this disease. Pathway for approval, therefore, for pharma is undefined. And then we really don't understand what cholangio is. Intrahepatic cholangio is classified as cancer unknown primary, as an upper GI cancer. I found in some countries like Asia, in China, it's treated in a similar way like liver cancer. But this is where the opportunity exists. It is an increasing in incidence, and the trials that you saw earlier, about 46 of them, are limited by spots rather than by accrual. You'll hear a presentation in the next few minutes by Dr. Weinberg, who did a trial in 5% of cholangios and have got a very successful result. So these studies are possible. It has the highest incidence of any actionable mutations in any GI cancer, and that is really what the blessing is, and that's why the field has gone forward, and that's why we are here, and not at the small inn where we began. It is an orphan disease, and that is perhaps an advantage. Pharma can leverage the findings towards approval, and we are really blessed with this really strong advocacy group for a disease that is uncommon, unknown. Stacy and her group have just done a phenomenal job. So we serve this International Cholangio Research Network with a handful of institutions, and I'm proud to say that over the last 3 years, there are about 40 and additional and growing list of institutions that are part of network. Now, our next challenge is how can we engage these institutions so that this membership is productive and all our members are partners and leaders in this field. So our focus in the last 3 years has been building databases, clinical, genomic, and relevant information in trying to understand how intrahepatic differs from extrahepatic, how cholangio in Asia and China differs from cholangio in Europe and US. We have built a huge portfolio of industry partners, and I think we have over 100 companies now that have been engaged, largely due to efforts of Kathy Wagner, the Director of Development. We have our own trials. I'm proud to say we have 3 now. Our biggest initiative and an ambitious and audacious initiative is the batch trial that we hope to initiate, and for that we're going to need your help to get this through. The Mutations Matter initiative is Milinda's and Stacy's initiative to increase profiling, and we are partnering with them with the survey that she just mentioned. We have web-based resources, and very importantly, we have an Asian outreach that I'll describe in the next few minutes. Now, I'm going to invite my colleague, Louis Roberts, who has been leading the Genome-Wide Association study. So this is the biorepository of blood, tissue, and clinical information that is being leveraged to discover new drivers, new signals in this disease.
Thanks very much, Milind. And so this is, I think, one of the types of collaborations that we've had, networking with several of the institutions, many of the investigators that are here. And what we're trying to do with this particular collaboration is a genome-wide association study, which is looking at variation in the inherited genetic material that each of us carries, our DNA, that we each have, that we inherited from our parents, to see if we can identify regions or variations in that DNA that are associated with a higher risk for cholangiocarcinoma. So the way we do this, of course, is we have to start by obtaining blood DNA or saliva DNA samples from as many people as we can that have cholangiocarcinoma. Look at the variations in their DNA across the entire genome. So your genome has 3 billion bases. So these individual ACTGs that you've all learned about in science, the DNA codes that code for the RNA that makes the proteins that form the substance of all of our tissues. That DNA makes different enzymes. It makes proteins that are involved in regulating different pathways in our bodies. And some of those pathways, when they go awry, result in the development of cancer. So what we're looking for is if we can identify those variants that are associated with increasing our risk, and so of risk of bowel duct cancer. And so what we've done over the past few years is develop this genome-wide association study. And so our goal was to genotype across the genome using chips that will assess about 600,000 of those bases. And so if we can assess these 600,000 bases, we can guess at almost all the other locations in our 3 billion bases of the genome. So we're using a chip that allows us to do this, and our initial goal is what we articulated here, was to be able to do it in 2,800 patients with cholangiocarcinoma, as well as around 400 patients with gallbladder cancer, and then about twice as many people who don't have these diseases that we would serve as controls. And so then after the discovery phase, our hope is to do a validation phase where we do a similar number of about 3,000 cases and controls. And what I'll describe to you is the initial discovery phase. And so this is these are the sites that are participating. We can see we ended up with 25 sites from really across the world, North America, Europe, and all the way to Australia. And again, I wanted to thank the patients and some of you here who have participated by providing your samples, as well as the investigators at the collaborating sites. This is just a list of the collaborating sites, and you can see, I think, these numbers, I think, about close to what we ended up with. We ended up with about 2,600 samples from patients with cholangiocarcinoma and about 600 from patients with gallbladder cancer for this discovery phase. We were very fortunate that the National Cancer Institute in their intramural program actually agreed to do the genotyping. So the genotyping is actually costing us nothing to do. They're actually genotyping as we speak. We had hoped in the fall that we might actually have data to show you, but I think that we'll have to wait for next year's meeting. And so we're quite excited about this. And what we anticipate, as I mentioned, is that afterwards we are going to have to submit a grant application to collect the samples that we need for validation. We know several of the participating sites without funding are already beginning to collect these samples, but we'll need additional funding to complete the collection of what we hope will be another set of about 3,000 samples to validate this work. So we submitted a grant already, and we submitted a grant. The reviewers came back and said, we want to see your initial data before we give you funding for the validation. So that's why we've been working on the discovery phase so hard. So we're anticipating that if we can get some data by later on this spring, we will submit in the summer or fall and hopefully get funded next year for this validation phase. Thanks very much for everyone's participation, and we look forward to being able to share some of the results by this time next year. Thanks.
Thank you, Louis. And I think this sort of pioneering work will teach us what causes cholangiocarcinoma, what was the risk in the individual patient. I have a few slides, just 2 slides, on why collaboration with Asia is important. First of all, we cannot impact on the burden of the disease if we ignore where the disease exists and where the prevalence of the disease is highest. But really, if we conduct trials, we conduct collaborative trials in Asia and in the West, the data from these trials could be then leveraged for approval of drugs in really any country. And this is really a list of cancers that are more prevalent in Asia but are regarded as orphan in the US. So it is important that we work with these partners, and that was really an important goal for our group over the last 3 years. So this was our first meeting, and we went to Thailand, and you can see this in northern Thailand, where the incidence of cholangiocarcinoma is the second biggest cause of cancer death in northern Thailand. And you can see the cholangiocarcinoma ward is sort of hard to read about, all the patients being treated there. And then I have to mention that the upcoming conference, we will have the 3rd conference, and this has been led by Flavio. Flavio, are you here? Yes. Flavio has done a spectacular job along with Li Zong Chen. I believe close to 200 participants now, registrations, and this number will grow. And we really look forward to working with patients from there, industries from Asia, collaborative trials with our colleagues there. These are, the trial portfolio, the trials that we have launched in our network, and it's really hard to do multi-center trials if you're not a big pharma. But this has been achieved thanks to the CREW network and Tony Saab at Mayo Clinic. One trial is already open. It's a neoadjuvant trial for high-risk cholangiocarcinoma, as you heard from Melinda, as you heard from Hillary. Patients are looking for aggressive options. So this is patients who would get aggressive chemotherapy, hopefully followed by resection. And then there are 2 trials which are targeted therapy trials. Our biggest initiative, really the most ambitious one, is the batch initiative. And Nitesh, you could present from there as well if you like. He's going to talk to us a little bit about this initiative.
Thank you, Milind. So this is an initiative that stemmed from the need to meet the needs of patients who get profiled and where we find sort of these low prevalent alterations where we feel drugs could make it, as you'll hear in Dr. Weinberg's talk that will follow. We modeled this on an existing program at the National Cancer Institute called MATCH, which is really sort of tumor agnostic. It's focusing just on targets, but we know if we really want to get a sense in specific diseases how things work, we need to do disease-dedicated initiatives to really hone out the data. So as Dr. Javle alluded to, Cholangiocarcinoma, which is a component of what we call biliary tract cancers, is the most target-rich gastrointestinal cancer, and it's up to the patient, investigator, and industry community to transform this knowledge into approved drugs. Next slide. So the hypothesis is based on what I just told you. This would form a platform for multiple trials to be running in parallel and in sequence to fill the slots as trials are completed. So the structure of this would be patients would get genetic profiling done, and Stacy and her team have really made this a communication initiative in terms of bringing about awareness that all patients should be profiled. While it might not be considered standard of care yet, I think the realization is that why wait for the standard of care? Let's do it now, because it can have an impact for patients in real time. We don't need to wait years and years before we embark on this. So patients would get profiled while they're getting their initial therapy, and then based on what is found, they would have access to any one of the many arms that their genetic profile reveals. And one of the unique features of this platform is that about 25 to 30% of patients will have no sort of targetable alteration that's found, but even for those patients, there'll be an arm here. So it's very much patient-centric as opposed to industry, company, or drug-specific. As they say for these initiatives, it takes a village to make it happen. This will really need to be done by, close to 100 or larger centers in the U.S. and Canada, and it will require all of the cooperative groups that are funded by the U.S. and Canadian government to step up to the plate and help execute. The unique feature, again, of this effort is that it's driven by patients and advocates in terms of making it happen. It's facilitated by investigators in industry, but it's really driven to meet the needs of what patients and advocates have identified.
Thank you, Mitesh. I also want to point out that while we talk of profiling and molecular profiling, in our own experience at MD Anderson, where we try to profile everybody, actually only 40% of biliary cancer patients do get profiling information back. People don't have adequate tissue, the biopsy was inadequate, and out of the patients who get profiling, 30% have trials. So it's actually only 10 or 15% of the entire population who with intention to treat profiling get the result we are hoping for. That is a targeted therapy trial. And I put this slide up for lung cancer, where molecular profiling is very well accepted. EGFR therapy is well accepted. Only 60% of patients get profiled for lung cancer, a much more common disease. So what we are facing here is a bigger battle. So this has really led to the Mutations Matter initiative by Stacy and Melinda, where we are educating ourselves, educating patients about why it's important. And then the targeted therapy survey, which I would really encourage you all to participate in, so that we can find out what the trends are for next generation sequencing, for profiling, what providers feel, what patients feel, how long they are willing to wait for the results. Parallel to this, we are also studying the natural history of mutations. So Mitesh mentioned we'll have several arms. Dr. Weinberg will present a study on BRAF mutation. We don't really know, however, what is the natural history of BRAF mutation without this targeted therapy. So that is an initiative that we are going to focus on. Several of our pharma partners are helping us with this initiative so that we can understand what is the actual impact of targeted therapy. Now, while we talk of targeted therapy and molecular profiling, actually more patients with biliary cancer die of infections and sepsis and catheter issues. So this has led to our partnership with the Nursing Advisory Board, led by Sue Acquisto and Renuka Iyer, and they have done some very important work in educating patients and providers about nursing management for patients with cholangiocarcinoma.
Thank you, Milind. 6 years ago, our Nursing Advisory Board was developed, and we had the support of many of the physicians in this room and the physicians up here on this stage to help us recruit nursing from all over the United States to our board, and even internationally. We have representatives from each of the institutions across the nation in their respective specialty, whether it be transplant, medical oncology, radiation oncology, surgical, interventional radiology, and the like. And with this collaboration and with the great support of the Medical Advisory Board, we identify important aspects of care for our patients and what's important to our patients, what do they need to be taught. One of the first things that we did was develop the biliary emergency card with the help of Dr. Renuka Iyer, who is on our medical advisory board, who then also a big shout out to her, funded our first scholarship for nurses to be able to attend this conference for this year. And we had 3 awardees be able to attend our conference. And it's very important as we go forward in working with collaboration with our medical advisory board, but with our patient. We also have a patient advocate on the board as well. Well, cholangitis, we found with the patients, especially in the Facebook groups, that they were going to their fellow patients to figure out what to do with their stents and drains, and should they be bathing, should they go in the spa, can they travel, how much drainage should they expect, what should they be expecting on their drain site care. And although discharge instructions were provided by the providers at the hospital, you know, it's when they get back home and they have these questions that they really kind of need immediate answers, and so they turn to their peers. And so in that, we found that they needed help with biliary stents and drains and teaching, that the nurses even in our institutions needed help with guiding and teaching the patients. So we developed what's called clinical practice nursing guidelines, and that we developed regarding fatigue, patients experiencing extreme fatigue, the nausea and vomiting, the treatments of gemcitabine, cisplatin, those that had biliary stents and drains, transplant patients, as well as getting the photon therapy, radiation therapy. And so with those clinical nursing practice guidelines, we did present all over the United States and actually to the European Oncology Nursing Society, the Transplant Society, ASCO, and also been presented also with the physicians here in Asia, at Thailand, and in China to share our guidelines with the physicians and nurses across the globe. And then we developed the cholangitis guideline, for which many of the patients sitting in this room participated in our survey on our first day, where we presented, because we wanted to hear your input as to what the teaching that we're teaching the nursing is what's important to the patients to learn. And from your surveys, many of you had heard of cholangitis, but we discovered that, you know, there are some important signs and symptoms that need to be taught and reinforced to our patients for those first symptoms to get into to their provider for urgent care. In addition, we are doing a prospective study with the NCCN centers on discharge instructions for patients on biliary stents and drains. Our hepatobiliary panel, many of the physicians in this room sit on that panel, helped us with contacts in their institutions to provide us so that we could give to them the questionnaire as to what discharge instructions are actually going to be provided and should be standardized. We're presenting that study at the NCCN conference this March in Florida, and working with them to help them establish guidelines for standardized discharge instructions for patients for drains and stents. We then, with our model of the clinical nursing practice guidelines, have been told that, and it's been published, that the Oncology Nursing Society has adopted our model of publishing clinical nursing practice guidelines, where we do the extensive literature search. We add that with institutional practice. We have an evidence-based rating with the Johns Hopkins evidence-based rating scale for our literature. We have a consensus and then established guidelines that ultimately approved by the Medical Advisory Board. So we were really excited about the work that this group has done. with the great support from the Medical Advisory Board that we continue to get. And so for the nurses in the group or in the audience, we are always recruiting. It's a great way to get published. It's a great way to contribute to your own scientific knowledge and also to set up the platform for further research to improve standards of care for our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for your very important work. I want to mention very briefly in the couple of minutes we have left that to facilitate our work, we have established these working groups. Immuno-oncology is a very active one, surgery, radiation oncology, and database, a group with Laura and Lipika. Just to give you a flavor of what these groups really do, I'm going to ask Rashna to present a few slides on what the immuno-oncology group has done so far and where you hope to go.
Thank you, Milind. So the Immuno-Oncology Working Group is a group of a lot of really passionate minds kind of working together. It's spearheaded by Nilo Azad, who could not make it to the conference this year. And we have investigators basically from all over the country. We currently have monthly calls. The idea is to really share data and to Milind's point, to kind of break down the silos and see what work is happening across the country. And the idea is to have that preclinical work and basic science work translate into actual clinical trials and to try to push the needle forward in that space. So these are just a couple things that we have going on. I mean, our ideas are, like I said, look at what we have seen at our institutions in terms of some preclinical rationale, and based on that data, submit LOI concepts to companies and to kind of leverage the work that's going on in the correlative space as well. So we have a number of discussions going on with multiple companies looking at different immuno-oncology concepts and combinations. I think yesterday the ETCTN study of cobimetinib and atezolizumab was already highlighted, but that is a perfect example of the rapidity with which a study can be designed, opened, and accrued fully. So we're kind of using that as our benchmark. We are discussing different concepts, and I'm not going to go into the specifics here, but we're discussing different concepts based on some work that Dr. Javle and I did out of MD Anderson before I moved, and then Dr. Hong and Dr. Azad have done through their collaborations, looking at, not only taking different immuno-oncology combinations, but also looking at the combination of things like radiation with immuno-oncology drugs. We already have one concept that has been submitted for consideration that Dr. Kundrana and Dr. Azad led. And like I said, we're in multiple discussions with multiple companies to look at a TIM3 and PD-1 combination as well.
Thank you very much, Rashna. Clearly the hope here in this disease is immuno-oncology, but the signal is so far muted, so your efforts of your group will be very helpful. The group has already participated in a Department of Defense grant. They are working on cell lines, preclinical models with Greg Lisinski, who's here, and Nilo Azad's lab. So I want to conclude by a slide that I borrowed from my friend Jeffrey Lee, which has now become our motto. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you very much.